Hey everyone, welcome to Learning Lab, where we talk about the science of learning. Today, I'm excited to welcome Brian Roxas. Brian has a rare cognitive characteristic called aphantasia, which means he doesn't experience visual imagery in the way most people do. Brian studied economics and philosophy at Cornell and later earned his MBA from Columbia. His views on learning are informed by his study of epistemology, which is the philosophy of knowledge, as well as his personal experience. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little bit about aphantasia. What is it and how did you realize that you had it?
So, aphantasia is, you explained it well. It's the inability to sort of visualize things in your mind. The way that, to put it in simpler terms, it's really just I don't have a mind's eye. For example, like when I close my eyes, no matter how much I think, I don't see anything. And I actually didn't realize I had it until basically in college because I thought that was normal. Like I thought when people would say things like close your eyes, picture yourself on a beach. It's more like, hey, imagine the vibes of a beach is sort of what I thought people were saying. I had no idea people were literally seeing themselves on a beach. I mean, even that thought is wild to me, even though I know that's like 96% of the population.
Do you remember the exact moment that you realized it?
I don't remember it super clearly, but I do remember having a conversation with a friend, and they were like, it was like part of a game where you're meant to, it was like a psychology analysis, close your mind, picture a box. What color is the box? What do you see about the box? What's the box made out of? And I was like, whoa, this is like way too much detail for like a vibes question. And I was like, I have no idea what you're asking me. And that kind of like led to some tension and confusion until we finally realized like, oh, this is unusual. Like most people are able to actually see a box when they do this exercise. But things like that are just like completely inaccessible to me.
Do you think of aphantasia as a limitation, a difference, or something else entirely?
It's an interesting question because you might think of it as disability in some way, in the same way that like you might consider like blindness or like the loss of a sense to be a disability. But I kind of view it differently because I don't think that it's like held me back in any way. It's forced me to process information in a different way. And when I learned that I did that, certain things started to make more sense to me. Like my non-visual memory has always been very good. But for example, spatial reasoning, like imagine a cube and you rotate it, like I've never been able to do any of that kind of stuff.
Do you think your memory is stronger in certain areas like logic, patterns, or facts?
I think so. I think the fact that, my brain is not storing visual memory, I don't know if our brains work quite the same way as computers, but it's sort of in my mind, the way it feels to me is that I have more capacity for other types of memory. This might be like super nerdy, but one example of this is I had this contest in middle school with a friend to see who could memorize the most digits of pi in like a single day. I won pretty decidedly, and still to this day, that was middle school. So like 20 years later, I can still recite maybe like 50 to 100 digits. And that was something I hadn't looked at in 20 years.
Do you have any unique tactics or strategies that you use to help you memorize without being able to use visual imagery that most people can?
When I was younger, I used to like rehearse things in my head over and over again in order to memorize it. Like, for example, when I was memorizing those digits of pi, I just like spent an hour or 2 hours like just reading the same, 20 digits in a row until I could do it effortlessly. And then I would do the next 20 digits and the next 20 digits. I was able to memorize things in like chunks of information. I don't know if this is like really clear though, but you might think of it more as like I'm stamping like a process in my brain as opposed to a picture. An analogy that I would use for this is it's sort of like I can't, if my brain is a computer, I can't store like JPEGs or like PNG images, but I can store like document files. And so my brain just records all the details that somebody else would just see in a picture, but I have it like essentially as like text in my brain. I'm not seeing the text, but that's what I'm recalling.
Interesting. So would you say you like excel at like reading over other modalities?
Yeah, yeah. And that's a really interesting one too, because I feel like I've had this discussion with others that they're like, well, what is reading like for you? Because for me, it's sort of like watching a show. I'm like, I'm reading, but in my mind, I'm actually picturing the characters. They look like something to me. And for me, I'm like, I read, for example, Hermione was a young girl with brown hair and bespectacled. Um, I have no idea what that looks like, but I remember those details. She has brown hair, and so later on, if there's like a reference to her brown hair, that's not surprising to me. But I have no idea what she looks like. Like, in my head, I don't have a version of her. The only, Hermione for me is Emma Watson because that's the only thing I've ever seen.
Are there certain modalities that work best for you then? Like, do you have like audio or probably not visual, right? Or would you even say that you can learn visually if you see it like in a picture?
So that's a really great question because I think it goes to something that I have found like really helpful about learning labs philosophy and what you're doing because I do believe that the best way to imprint something in your mind is to learn it through multiple channels. And so even though my like visual channel is weaker than most people's, the vast majority of people's, it's still something that solidifies things in my head. So, for example, I brought up Hermione earlier. I can remember the details. And then when I see Emma Watson on the screen, it sort of solidifies, oh, yeah, that's the vibe that Hermione goes for. So, even if my visual processing isn't quite as good, it still supplements the other types of modalities that I have.
And so basically what you're saying is it helps to learn the information is through multiple methodologies.
Exactly. Yeah.
What advice would you give to students who do learn differently than their peers? Because to my understanding, there's not that many people out there with aphantasia, right? So maybe for our audience, for someone who's listening to this and does maybe their brain processes information differently, or they have some sort of learning difference, and maybe they're struggling, maybe they're not. But like, what advice would you have for someone like that?
I think this is something I can empathize with a lot because I've definitely had teachers who just could not reach me in school. No matter how they tried to explain something, just their way of explaining it would not click with me. So, what I learned to do, the way that I've been successful in my academic career is frankly by just learning how to teach myself based on how I've been able to remember things in other ways. So, for example, I used to play a lot of video games growing up, and I would learn. I don't really remember the picture of like, oh, you're supposed to turn left here when you see this tree or something. But instead, I noticed I was able to remember things more if I closed my eyes and just was like left, right, A, B, just like memorizing the inputs in my head. And that kind of gave a signal to me, even as a kid, that, okay, when the teacher's like showing a picture of a clock, let's say it's first grade, you're learning how to read a clock, a teacher showing a picture of a clock, all the other students are like trying to remember how it looks like. I'm ignoring the teacher and trying to find the details that speak to me. Like, okay, the small one means minute. I understand that concept. This means that. And it maybe took me a little bit longer to get the picture, but frankly, that exercise of teaching myself how to learn is what enabled me to be successful for the rest of my academic career.
How do you go about that? How do you go about figuring out how your brain works and how you learn best?
My honest advice is just to take the pressure off it. Life is a learning journey. I think, frankly, some students put so much pressure on their academic success that they try to force themselves to learn the way that they're supposed to. They see friends of theirs who are successful in the same class, and they think, well, if they're learning it this way, I should be able to learn it that way too. And so they're trying to force themselves into a particular style of learning because they're too scared to go off on their own. But like for me, learning that clock example, it did feel insecure for me to not get it as quickly as others. But the confidence came more when I started to learn outside of school and started to teach myself, like, oh, this is how I'm understanding the world. And just being a lifelong student, being curious about everything, whether it's going to be on a test or not, or it's just random trivia, that really is what inspired me, I think, to keep finding new ways to learn.
So one of the challenges in education is that there's one teacher for multiple students in a class. In grade school, you might have 20, 30 students in class. You get to undergrad, and there could be hundreds of students in a class. Do you think if a teacher could have been more aware and more able to tailor their messaging and the way they communicate to how you process information, would you have gotten more out of the classroom?
First of all, I totally agree that like the one size fits all model does not reach all students, and it certainly didn't reach me. I hesitate to say that the teacher should have catered differently to me. I know that's not your question, but I wouldn't have encouraged individual attention from my teacher who's trying to teach hundreds of students. But yeah, I think if you notice that you're not learning things the same way as others, I've never been shy about tutoring and asking others for help. Everybody in this world knows something that you don't. And if you humble yourself to say, this person might not even be doing as well in this class, but they are able to teach themselves differently in this class. So I can still learn something from them. So I think even if it's not a teacher, finding people who can help you learn in your own unique style will always be helpful.
So this is a recurring question that we have on Learning Lab. If you were to design a learning platform that's tailored specifically to you and how your brain works, what are some core features or functionality that platform would have?
Very great question. Because I learn things in different ways, I would like it if like one subject, there were like multiple modalities. So for example, you're learning, let's say, how to integrate in calculus. If there was one way where it's like you can look at these different charts and like change the graph based on the equations and just see how that interacts, that would be helpful. And then separately, there might be like a list of rules and like process flows. And then separately, there might be like an even more abstract version where you're learning like what the definition of integrals were and what the applications are. Another customization feature that would be helpful is if you could put a preference. So like, for example, no matter what subject, I prefer to learn auditorily first. Then I would like to solidify it with visual learning, etc. So something where I'm able to organize first by subject and then by modality would be like my ideal platform.
So there's a little bit of a debate about learning styles, different modalities, and should platforms tailor to that, and should teachers tailor to that? Do you have any opinions or thoughts on that?
Going back to what we were talking about before, it's just not feasible for a teacher to give individual attention to every one of their students' unique learning styles. But providing resources is a very easy way to help students, even the students in your class who you can't reach with your natural teaching style. So I would encourage teachers to provide resources.
So I want to transition to the philosophy of learning, the philosophy of knowledge. You are kind of a self-proclaimed philosophy nerd. What does it mean to know something? For example, like how do we know that we learned something?
Yeah. So there's different schools of thought in philosophy as to how you can measure whether or not you know something. But the general question here is just like you said, how do you know that you aren't just repeating something that you memorized and you actually understand it? And this is an important thing for people to understand about themselves because if you just memorize like a list of facts, for example, in a math course, it might be difficult for you to apply that, right, when it comes time to actually take the test. And so you do need to have some way to measure whether you actually know it and understand it deeply versus whether you've just memorized it well enough to, do decently on your homework. And I think one school of thought as to how you can be sure that you actually understand it is by your ability to teach it to somebody else who has never heard anything about the subject with no context. Because if you can sort of create the entire subject in somebody else's mind, it means that you have the full subject in your own mind.
What do you think the relationship is between memorization and the application of knowledge? Because I've always thought that how smart you are is the combination of what you know, like
Mm,
what you've learned maybe in the past, just what information you have, and
mm.
how you can and would and will apply that information in whatever context it might be. But I've always kind of thought that memorization and application of that knowledge is deterministic of how smart you are. What are your thoughts on that? What is the relationship between memorization and the application of that knowledge?
You're right that both are important for knowing that you understand something. I actually think memorization needs to come first. Like you need to understand the facts of something in order to have the context around it. But really, once you have the context, you can't master something just understanding it at a general level. I think to really master something, you need to understand how to take control of the subject and play with the concepts in your own way and see how you can relate them to each other. So somebody learning, for example, how to code, it's one thing to just memorize like int means this, right? This function means this. But to be able to build a full scale, like what you guys are doing, it really requires you to take that knowledge and solidify the information, but then be able to build and create something from that. And so I think, the relationship to me is sort of like you take things in and you sort of mix it with whatever's in your brain. And what you're able to spit out is basically the proof of your knowledge base.
How does setting goals play a factor in learning? Does your goals inform like how you might learn or how you go about learning?
Yeah, completely. In many ways, I think the first way that it would influence me is frankly just the timeline. If my goal is to understand something well enough to take a test, frankly, at earlier stages in schooling, memorization is probably enough. But as you progress further and further in your schooling, suddenly you're not just turning in a homework assignment every day. You're meant to spend like a month creating one research paper that's really deep. And so memorization wouldn't cut it in that case. One thing is like, do I actually need to learn this to pass a course, or am I going to need this to advance to the next course in my major, or am I going to be able to apply this in the job in my field that I eventually get? Your goals will inform the level of knowledge that is required for you to.
So, what are your thoughts on how do you stick to your goals?
Yeah, um, you're totally right. And I have also, I'm human. I've fallen victim to trying to set some goal for a whole year and then skipping a week at the gym and then kind of everything falling through. For me, I think if I'm just setting a goal for the sake of having something to move forward, those types of goals will never stick for me. I don't know if this will work for everybody, but because my brain is like wired towards philosophy, I'm really wired towards trying to find the underlying meaning of things and starting from there and building out. I think some people try to find a process and then justify it or come up with some purpose or meaning behind what they're doing. But I've always been a like purpose first. And so I now don't set goals that aren't meaningful to me. And I need to, understand what is the purpose of this? Am I trying to get fit just to like show off or because I feel insecure about my body? Or am I trying to get healthy because it's actually going to extend my life and it's going to allow me to spend more time with my family to be able to take care of my kids someday? And when I understand like exercise in that lens, it really tells me like, okay, I'm not doing this because it's a new year. I'm not doing this because I think I should or because other people are. Maybe I start at January 1st, maybe I start at mid-January, but this is an important goal for me to keep. And so I'm going to prioritize it and I'm going to cut things out of my life in order to make room for this. So that's my process.
People set these goals because they know they want to. It's not like they're just like, at least in my experience, when I hear people talk about New Year's resolutions, like they want to achieve losing weight, or maybe it's studying more, or just being more
Mm.
disciplined in whichever fashion. But I think when the moment comes, they just can't get themselves to do it. I think because you talked about just the underlying reason of why you're setting the goals, how can they use that reasoning to motivate themselves in the moment? Especially for students, and they have to study, and their motivations may be different as well. They may be motivated by the grade rather than actually learning. When it's maybe a scenario like that where it's like you're not internally motivated, but you're externally motivated. How do you still stick to your goals and stick to what you want to accomplish when the moment comes?
That's a very fair point. I think at this point in because I've graduated college about a decade ago, I suppose I have sort of forgotten that feeling of like, oh, I hate the subject, but I need to pass it in order to, get my degree. But you're right that those are the hardest goals to stick to when you actually don't care about reaching the goal, but you just know you need to. In those cases, when I can't find the internal motivation, there's sort of two ways that I've approached this in my life. I'll say the way that is less helpful first. The first is I just kind of kick my own ass and tell myself to do it. The same way that like your parents might have said, you're not allowed to have dessert until you finish your homework or something. You're not allowed to play video games until you finish your homework. I would sort of impose those sorts of rules upon myself. Like, I'm not allowed to go to this party if I don't finish this paper tonight, if it was college. But I know that not everybody is going to be able to like be so strict with themselves. So the other way that I found myself to be motivated, in addition to trying to be strict with myself, is finding a support. One external motivator could be, right, like your teacher and the grades. But another external motivator could just be you have friends in that class, and it's fun to talk about the subject with them, or at least like talk about the class together, even if you don't love the subject. You can talk about like something funny that your professor said or something that shocked you, and really getting invested in the class, like because it's a group activity, I think is a good way to sort of cement yourself in the subject.
I have one last question before we get you out of here. One of the qualms that I have with the education system is the grading, how we are assessing students. Is there anything within the philosophy of knowledge and the philosophy of learning that we can learn from so that we can better assess a particular student?
I think the entire education system needs to be revamped, at least in the US. I'm not as familiar with other types of education systems. But in the US, I do think the emphasis on memorization is much too strong. The fact that we have elementary school students spending from 7 a.m. till 3 p.m., right? They're spending 8 hours of their day like inside trying to learn from somebody talking at them. I think that's really tough. What the philosophy of knowledge would tell you is that memorization is not the same thing as knowledge. And if you really want them to know something so that they're building their mental model, they're building something in their mind, you want them to be active and trying to apply it. So, in a math assignment, rather than having them just calculate some abstract exercise, it would be great if math teachers were able to have students go out in the field, say, hey, look at that building based on this tree's height. What can we say about how tall that is, or how long it would take for somebody to scale that, or something like that, right? I think those sorts of real world applications should be more present in the classroom. And it frankly makes me a little sad that it's not as emphasized as something like rote memorization.
Brian, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for studying philosophy, because I don't know that many people that nerd out on that kind of stuff. And I think that's helpful perspective for us to apply those insights into what we do on a daily basis so that we can better the education system, better the learning experience for students. Thank you for your time.
No, absolutely. It was my pleasure to be here, and I'm so supportive of your mission and what you guys are doing. So keep up the good work.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.